Hello everyone, and welcome to this first Tech AMA session for Google Scholars in the Android Developer track. My name is Jose, and I'm here to help you with your questions. We have received a lot of questions, and it has been very difficult to decide which ones will appear on the video. If yours don't appear on the video, don't worry, we will have more opportunities in the future. That said, let's get this party started. The first question is, while thinking about the architecture of the app, is it better to make it dependent on one activity that has as many fragments as possible, or it can have multiple activities? One of the principles of string programming is called interface segregation, which essentially says that it's much better to have a big number of small interfaces than a small number of big interfaces. We don't have interfaces in this question, but we can apply kind of a similar logic. Imagine that you have an activity that deals with so many things. That activity will be super big, and the code will be doing a lot of different things. And that will become like kind of a spaghetti, very complex thing that is difficult to understand and modify and maintain. That's obviously not desirable at all. So it's much better that each screen of our app is a completely different activity, and we have as many activities as we need. Why don't we use fragments every time instead of activities? Well, it seems to be a bit of a misunderstanding here. We always need to have an activity. An activity is a screen of our app, and in that activity we can use fragments or not. But there's not such a scenario in which we have fragments without having an activity. That said, fragments are helpful in certain circumstances and become useful in certain scenarios. If you are not going to take advantage of any of that, if you don't need that, then don't use fragments. Only use them when it makes sense to you. Is there a different way to manage the notifications on different API levels? Or we have always to use multiple if for each version, like in exercise 10.03 and notification actions. And I'm afraid to say that there's no other way to deal with that. In certain things, the APIs changes so much from one version to another that we need to write some bit different code depending on which API level we are. In other words, it's not something that we can avoid. Luckily, this is not something that happens every time. And if we don't support older versions, that will be minimized. Why not make it clear to everybody that you can make your data survive orientation changes by putting the data into a static variable? No need for retained fragments or other more complicated methods. When I read this question from a student, I put it straight on the video because I think this is something where we can learn a lot of things. Saving our data in static variables is a really bad thing, and let me explain why. To start with, let's imagine an app, like an example. So an app can be, for example, a to-do list. So we have a screen, an activity, where we have a list of the things that we have to do, and a button that takes us to a second activity where we find a form to create a new to-do. In that form, we can have some edit text, some radio buttons, checkbox, and other things to introduce the details of that task. Let's say, for example, the name of the task, the due date, the importance level, and so on. Then you write down the things in the form and you rotate the device. According to the question here, you can put that data in a static variable. What will happen then? As you probably know by now, when you rotate the device, your activity gets destroyed. Then a new activity gets created. That activity can notice that you have some data in those static variables. Then restore the form from the data that is stored in those static variables. And that will, in theory, work, but it's not that good. Now, First of all, you will need to store the data in those variables. And once the activity is rotated, you will need to restore that data and populate the fields. Well, it doesn't seem that you have saved any effort. You are doing the same thing, but in a different way. Now let's say that you click your back button and you come to the list. Again, you click on the new task button because you want to create a new task. What should happen? As a user, you will expect to find a completely empty form because you are creating a completely new task. Unfortunately, the static variables have data and the form will be populated with that data. Okay, let's say you can handle that. How? Well, when the user clicks the back button, you can clear the data in those static variables. Okay, now you are doing more job than the one that you were doing before. That doesn't seem like a good plan, to be honest. But that's not all. There are more problems related with this. For example, let's say that you click on the home button. Or let's go for something simple first. You can have multiple instances of the same activity within your app. And if it's a fragment, it comes like a more common scenario. You usually have many instances of the same fragment. So every time that you put data on those static variables, every time you clear data on those static variables, that applies to every instance of your activity or every instance of your fragments. And now you are starting to mess up. That's not good. Still, maybe you are very stubborn and you say, okay, Jose, what if I can guarantee 100% sure that there are no various instances of my activity? What if I can guarantee that there's no various instances of my fragment? Then everything should work. Okay, but remember, you're still doing more job than you should. But let's go ahead. It seems that it works, right? I click on the home button and we keep on using our device. Surf the internet, social media, read the news, I don't know, listen to some music, messaging, whatever. When you open one app, then the OS doesn't have memory enough, and it needs to kill an app. Your app, your to-do list app, has not been used for a while. Okay, so it can be killed. There's no any damage on that. Your app is killed, and the OS gets resources enough to run the app that you want to run in the foreground. After some time, you come back to your to-do list app. And what would you expect to happen? The expectation as a user is that you have no idea that that has happened. That has happened completely on the background, should be seamlessly and transparent to you. So as a user, you will expect to find the form exactly in the same state that it was when you left the app, maybe some hours ago. Unfortunately, that's not the case, and the form is completely empty. What has happened? The reason for that is that when your app was killed, and bear in mind that it can happen in any time, and you must guarantee that your app runs even in those circumstances, what happened is that the process was completely destroyed, including the static variables that it contained. So in other words, the data that you stored in those static variables was lost forever. Ouch. Yeah, as you can see, things are not so easy. And, well, you chop a tomato, probably you will use a knife. Can you use a hammer? I guess you can, but it's not the tool for that. Static variables are not meant to store data, so don't do that. It's a really bad practice. I hope I have convinced you. Okay, so next question. Why don't we use some libraries such as Volley or Retrofit? Why do we use things such as AsyncTask and AsyncTaskLoader instead? Well, you will end up using things such as Retrofit or Volley. That's for sure. But you need to understand other things. For example, let's say that you go to an interview, and the purpose of all this is that you learn and that you get to be employable. So you go to an interview and they ask you how you do your HTTP requests. Well, you say, I do with Retrofit, for example. Fair enough. What if the interviewer asks you, how would you do if you didn't have Retrofit or Volley? You cannot say, I don't know. You're not getting a job that way. Okay, maybe you say, well, I will use an AsyncTask. Nice. And can you explain what's the problem with AsyncTask? Well, look, I really don't know. AsyncTask is something I heard about somewhere, but it's not something I use. So obviously, I cannot explain to you why I don't want to use an AsyncTask, what's the advantages, or why I prefer to use Retrofit. So you need to get into some knowledge, and for that, you need to learn how the Android framework works in the inside. Okay. When is the right moment to use a library when building an app? Any library that could help with RecyclerViews, for example. Some other you have as apps, libraries for icons or different things. Well, you will use libraries. There's nothing wrong with that, of course. There's no a particular moment that is better. As soon as you understand what you're doing, you should use libraries. That's perfectly okay. When you try to look for the library, how do you find it? Okay, obviously you can Google, but I can recommend this website, which is called Android Arsenal. And here is like a compilation of many libraries, okay? And here you can share for different things, like for example, in the question from one of you was RecyclerViews. So here you can see a lot of libraries that are related with RecyclerViews. And you can order them for last update or for rating. You can go into the details of each of them, and you can go to the GitHub and see how they work. So this is a particularly good resource that you will end up using 100% guarantee. Okay, let's go for the next question. Should we learn Java or Kotlin? Well, I'm not surprised that some of you asked this question. For those who don't know, for a long time, since beginning of Android, we've been building our apps using Java. Since some time ago, we could use Kotlin for writing our apps. And it was in the last Google I/O this year that Kotlin became a fully supported language to build Android apps. Okay? Kotlin has some advantages, and it has a lot of momentum as well. The thing is, in an earlier stage in which you are on learning Android, we believe that you should use Java. And there are a few reasons for that. Similarly to what I was saying before with AsyncTask, how can you get a job as an Android developer if you don't know Java? It sounds a bit complex. Not impossible, but a bit difficult. You can have Java and Kotlin at the same time in the same app. Okay? They can live together. And a company could have some of the projects starting to have some of Kotlin. It's very difficult to find nowadays a project that is 100% Kotlin. And many companies will have a number of apps. And as an employee, you are expected to be able to work in all of them. And if the all ones are built in Java, which is the thing, to be honest, then how are they going to hire you? Not only that, but let's say you want to learn something, and you Google and find a tutorial about a particular topic. It will be written in Java. How are you going to understand if you don't know Java? So my advice is focus on Java for now, okay? Unless you are particularly skilled in Java already. And time will come, in a few months' time, you can probably start to do some bits of Kotlin here and there. but take it easy, okay? Each thing at the right time. So how can I stop code execution if certain condition is met? Finish does not seem to work. What does finish do? Okay, so just to clarify about this question, this is not referring to debugging. It's not referring like a stop the code execution as a debug mode. The question refers to what happens if I have a method that have a number of lines of code, and at some point I don't want to continue executing the rest of the code in the method. Okay, so usually for that you will use a return statement. There are some scenarios in which you can be inside a for loop, and if you want to completely get out of the loop, you can use break. Another scenario is that inside a for loop, you want to stop the execution of the current iteration, but continue with next, rather than sitting completely from the loop. For that, the statement that you will need to use is continue. So what about finish? Finish is not a Java-related thing. Finish is a method that belongs to the activities. It's completely an Android thing. The finish method will completely destroy and kill your activity. You may be thinking, why will I do that? Why will I want to completely destroy my activity? Well, it might not be obvious, but there's some particular scenarios in which you will end up wanting to do that. Not something that you're going to use every day, definitely, but it's something that might help in some situations. How to check easily if EditText fields are filled when I have many fields. Okay, so my understanding of this question is that what happens if you have a form with a lot of edit text, and in order to perform an action, let's say you click a button and you need to validate a form, and you need to check that none of them is empty. That I know, I'm afraid to say that there's no way apart from going one by one and checking. That's what it is. Sorry about that. How to change layout when rotating the device. For example, relative layout when normal state, and then rotate linear layout will be active. Well, let's go to Android Studio. This is an app, a simple app that I built for your friends at Android Basics, okay? I'm not going to go into the details of what the app does, but let's take a quick look at it. So we have an activity, and this activity uses this particular layout, okay, which is this one. Let's going to expand this here. As you can see, the layout is here. What I can do in order to fulfill this requirement is I can right-click here, say New Resource File, and create a new resource file with the exact same name. It will be activity main, and it will be a layout. And this layout will be for landscape. If I click OK, then the layout will be created. But I'm going to show you, instead of doing that, an easier way for this particular scenario. Okay? For this particular scenario, there's an easy way. That is, click in here and say create landscape variation. Okay, so what happened now? What happened is that we have two activity main files. One of them is in the layout folder, and the other is in the layout land folder, which means landscape. When your app is running, the system knows if the device is on portrait or landscape. Then, when your main activity onCreate method is called, it will pick the activity main layout accordingly to whether the device is in landscape or portrait. Obviously, those two layouts are completely different, and you can make them with a completely different design. Something to bear in mind is that obviously the IDs of the elements need to be common because otherwise your app will crash. But the design can be different, and that includes using a linear layout or a relative layout or reordering your views in a completely different way. Okay. Which of the new Android architecture components will fit better in Sunshine and how it will improve it? What is Room and how it relates to content providers? Okay, so there's one particular component in the Android architecture components libraries, which is called paging. Most people doesn't even know that paging exists. The reason for that is that paging was not included in the original architecture components announcement in the last Google I/O. Also, by the time of recording this video, paging is still in alpha version. Apart from paging, the rest of the architecture components can be easily added to Sunshine. Life cycles, live data, view model, and Room. Doing that might not be necessarily easy, particularly if you need to refactor a lot. But here is a collab that Lila wrote, and essentially what it does is takes a simplified version of Sunshine and adds, as you can see, live data, view models, all these fancy things. Okay, and the architecture might be a bit complex, so might not be for all of you at this stage to go into this. But if you are a bit more skilled, you have more experience, this is something that you can have a look at. And you just have to go to Colab's Developers Google, okay, and search for this build up with Arc components Colab. It's a really good resource, but as I said, it's a bit maybe too much for some of you, so don't worry about that. So what is Room and how it relates to content providers? Well, as I said, Room is one of the libraries of those Android architecture components. And to be more specific, is the library that does all the database. Okay. Now, how it relates with content providers. First of all, let's put all of us in the same line. Content providers are an abstraction layer that sit between your database and the rest of your code. And because it's an abstraction layer, the rest of your code doesn't need to know about the details of the database. Say that you use a Sqlite database and tomorrow you can swap for a different thing. The rest of the code will not be affected. Not only that, but it allows to expose your database to other apps, which is something that you might want to do or not. There are content providers in the system, like the media provider or media providers for contacts and many others. Okay. Now, if you want to do something with the database, and none of these things is something that you can really take advantage of, then it's probably you don't want to use a content provider. You will use a content provider if it makes sense, if you can take advantage of it. Otherwise, you'll probably want to skip, which makes completely sense. And if you skip the content provider, but still need a database, then you have many options out there. And probably Room is nowadays the best one to go for. Okay. Yeah. So what is Gradle? That's a good question. Okay, so Gradle is a build tool, and it helps us to make things automatically. Let me go to Android Studio for a second. So you know that your apps have many things, and some of them are your Java code and can be Kotlin code, of course. You have your XMLs that can be layouts, can be menus, can be things for values such as colors, strings, and translations for different languages. Obviously, you have the manifest and so on. Okay, so how would you create your app? Well, you will have to first compile the Java code. Then that will create the bytecode. I will speak about that in more detail now. And you will have to copy that and put in maybe a folder. And then you will have to take all your resources and your layouts and your images and any other assets that you may have and put them in somewhere that makes sense in your file system. If everything is okay, then you will have to zip that and change the extension to an APK and do a number of processes in the command line, which include signing and aligning. Have you ever done that? Well, you have. Actually, Gradle has done that for you. So Gradle does all this and ends up creating this APK. Okay, and let me show you this tool, which is the APK analyzer. Okay, and as you can see now in the APK analyzer, this is our app. Okay, and this has this Dex classes, the resources, layouts, all these things. So you have not done that. Gradle has. One more thing that Gradle does for you is managing the dependencies. So all this that is highlighted there are libraries, okay, that you need in your app. So if you add a new library, Gradle will automatically go to the internet, find it in probably Maven, Central, or wherever it is, download it, and put it in the right place so your code compiles. That's Gradle. One more thing about Gradle. There is a full course which is 100% Gradle in the Android Nano degree because it's something that you need to understand and know how it works. Why? Let me give you an example. A typical scenario that you have probably found often is that there are apps that have a free version with ads and a paid version that doesn't have ads. How can we do this? Well, one possible approach is to have two different projects. And that will be a pain because then if you have the free one and you make a change here, you need to remember that you will have to do as well in the paid one. And that sounds like a pain. And it will be quite error prone. So the way to go is to have one single code base. Then in that code base, you probably have two layouts with the same name. One of them has the banner on the bottom, the other one doesn't. And then depending on what you're building is the free version or the paid version, then Gradle will take the one with the ads or the one without it. That's the magic, and you will learn it soon. Java works on a virtual machine and computers. Does it work in the same way on Android? Well, the virtual machine in Android is a bit different. Okay, I'm not an expert on this, but I can tell you a bit. Dalvik was the old Java machine, the old virtual machine that we had in Android that was replaced in certain version by Odd, which is the Android runtime. So essentially these virtual machines have some optimizations for performance and battery and all these kind of things. The main difference is that when we have our Java code, then it goes compiling to bytecode, as you probably know. The bytecode runs in the Java virtual machine, but for Android, there's one more step that transforms that bytecode into what is called DEX files. And those DEX files are the ones that contain our code and run in the Android virtual machine. Okay, so what about the DEX files? Can you see here? That's the DEX file that Gradle put in the right place. inside our APK. Okay, one more thing. What is the best way to pass the context without causing a memory leak from the activity to the task-related class that is extended AsyncTask? Okay, this is a bit of a difficult question, I may reckon. Okay, so to start with, maybe not all of you know or have heard about memory leaks before. So let me explain what a memory leak is. Let's say that you have a class. Nothing in particular, something that you have created. Nothing that is related with Android. Okay? And in that moment, you create an instance of that app. That class is related with a point of memory, right? It's pointing to a point of memory. And then you pass a reference of the activity to that class. That class stores the reference to your activity in a variable. Now, it will come the point that your activity gets destroyed. In theory, the idea is that once that your activity is destroyed, then it's not needed anymore, which means that the garbage collector can remove it from the memory and leaving space for new objects to be allocated. If we didn't do that, then we will run out of space in the heap. The problem is that because the fact that your class has a permanent reference to the activity, the garbage collector cannot remove it, cannot garbage collect it. And that is a memory leak. And it can happen in certain circumstances and scenarios when you pass the activity as a context to the AsyncTask. This is not an easy thing to solve. And you can find different articles in Medium that are quite good on this. The most, common advice is to store that reference as a weak reference, because that will allow to be clean if the activity is destroyed. Also, I remember there is another way, that is, if you don't need to do certain things, and obviously this might not be the case, but if you can pass the context to the application context. I mean, instead of passing the activity as a context for the AsyncTask to use, you can pass the application context, which is a permanent and more long life context. So this way, when the activity gets destroyed, you don't have a memory leak. As I said, this second option is something that might not be compatible with what you want to do, or at least will imply some more complications. Okay? As I said, it's not a particularly easy thing to explain here in front of the camera. When working with database in the helper class, we have to override onUpdate. In the current implementation, we delete the entire database and then we create a new one. How can we do this without losing all the information? Okay, so just to clarify, what the question means is we have a database, and in our database we have some things that might be valuable for us. If updating the schema of the database, or the version, if you prefer to say like this, implies to completely delete the database and start from scratch, then we will be losing all our data. Actually, if you go to the video, you will see that the instructor says something like, we don't care in this point about the data, so we can drop and recreate the database. But obviously, if you don't want to lose your data, you will have to handle it properly. My understanding is that explaining how to handle that was out of the scope of what was going to be explained in that lesson. So let's say, let's close some of these things. Yeah, okay, so for example, if you search in Google how to modify or add a new column to your table, and you can find something like this. Okay, so here you see you have alter table statements, and that will be the kind of thing that you may want to do, okay, instead of dropping the table. Yeah, and you can find more information online. Okay, so I believe this is the last question. We got really a lot of questions that were related to databases. This is kind of a compilation of some bits here and there from many of you. The first one is, how can I access a remote database? Okay, so your remote database will be on a server, on that thing they call the cloud, okay? And how you interact with a server? Well, through an HTTP request. So you can make an HTTP request with GET or POST or PUT or whatever you need. And then the server will deal with that and give you a response back. That's out of the scope of the course, okay? In theory, you should have someone in the team who will be a backend developer. Still, I can tell you that there is a completely free course in Udacity about Firebase. And one of the main components of Firebase is a real-time database, which is completely free to use, by the way. So you may want to have a look at it. Should I use an ORM? Which one? So for those who don't know what an ORM is, this is an object relational mapping. Essentially, this means that we can have objects in our code, say our Java code, for example, and those objects and those fields in those objects can be mapped to the fields in the database. And when we change something in the objects, we can save the object, and that gets saved in the database. It's quite nice to use, not 100% necessary, but is of course an option. There are many ORMs for Android. If I had to choose one, well, I would say nowadays I will go for Room, because Room, from the architecture components that we spoke about before, is actually an ORM. Should I use some of the Android APIs to access Sqlite instead? Should I use Realm? So Realm is another type of database, and you're more than welcome to use whatever you prefer. There's no limitations on that. But, I must say, during the nano degree, you will need to use Sqlite. You will have to submit some of your projects for review to be evaluated. And for those projects, you will need to fulfill a number of requirements. And in some of the projects, you may find that the requirement is to use an Sqlite database or maybe even use a content provider. So using Sqlite, using a content provider, at the moment are not something that you can skip. So if you want to use Realm, for example, you can go ahead, or Room, fair enough. But for some of your projects, you will need to learn how to use Sqlite and content providers. And that was the last question for this session. Now, before finishing the session, it's almost Christmas, so I wanted to say that I hope that you all enjoyed your Christmas break. I know that many of you will take it that extra time to progress in the course. As usual, we will be on Slack and we will be happy to help. One more thing. Remember to subscribe and leave your comments below. Cheers. Bye-bye.